Gunn? Tim Gunn?
Yeah.
Tim Gunn.
Did you use gas? For what purpose?
It's really tight.
Thank you.
Let me give you my call. Let me give you my Rizk.
Oh, thank you. That'd be great. Yeah, yeah.
I really appreciate that straight out back. I was talking about that earlier because I was gonna do the back. I was like, I can't see. Yeah. I can't think of things that have like 20 heads. Yeah. Okay. I don't have. Oh, okay. So I couldn't follow myself.
Yeah. You can also find it on the website if you need it larger than what's on there. Everybody's is on the Housing Oregon website. Yeah, well, everyone who uploaded it is on the Housing Oregon website. But ours is uploaded, so if you find this event on the Housing Oregon website, then you'll find our slides. Along with a digital version of the brochure that you have, a digital version of this little guide. So it's all taken care of.
Yeah.
I don't think we need, I mean, it only takes like 2 seconds for it to, if we need it, so. It's gonna be great. We're gonna do great.
I recorded myself and then I played it on repeat while I was getting ready.
That's a good,
Like backed myself. I was
that's a
like,
good strategy. It's a good strategy. I really don't like the sound of my own voice.
I
So
like sound my own voice either,
yeah.
but I needed to know what I was gonna say or else I was gonna verbatim.
Yeah. Yeah, it was tough being a radio DJ and having to like, I recorded sweepers, like the bits in between when you say like call sign and stuff. And I edited them myself too. And so I just had to listen to myself.
What radio station?
It was a college radio station. Yeah. Yes. The Buzz. The Buzz FM. Black Hill State University. It was the only 24-hour college station in a 5-state radius. And it could be heard in a 5-state radius too, because middle of the Great Plains.
Yeah.
Our broadcast tower was like way up in the Black Hills, and it could just blanket the region.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that wild? It's like less
What town?
Crystal Lake.
I was also born in.
I was about to be like, what the heck?
That would be evidence that we're in the matrix.
I know. Everyone's like, oh my God, I was born in Crystal Lake.
You're actually in a coma. This is all hallucination.
Crystal Lake is the code word for the lab that we're all in.
We put out attendance sheets in a couple places. If you could fill those out and then pass them backwards, that would be great. There's 2 up here and then 2 in the middle. So I figured we could work that way. We're on with Zoom. Okay. Yeah. Do those doors still lock automatically when they're closed? Okay, it's fine. No. We'll leave them open. We'll leave them open.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. I know people are still digesting from lunch. My name is Samuel Goldberg. I use he, him pronouns. I'm an education and outreach specialist at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. I'm joined by my co-presenter, Gina Rizk, who is the education and outreach specialist for the Portland and Salem metro areas. We're going to be talking about accessible housing, identifying the need for accessible housing, identifying kind of the parameters of the crisis and what it means in real people's lives. And we're also going to be talking about more recent housing reforms at the state level and the local level and how those impact our ability to respond to the crisis of accessibility. So Gina's going to take the first section here. Yeah, I'll hand it over to her.
All right, I'm gonna lower this down because I'm not a tall person. So before we get started, I want to throw out a couple of statistics. So these statistics were taken from the 2019 American Communities Survey from the U.S. Census Bureau. Sorry, I'm going to take this off. Give me a second. So for 18 to 64-year-old Oregonians living with a disability, and this is self-reported, by the way, 26.5% are below the poverty line versus 11% of the general population who did not report a disability. 34.4% are housing cost burden versus 23.2% of the general population. And when I say housing cost burden, what I mean is more than 30% of their income every month is going toward their housing. So for example, if I make $2,000 every month and I pay $1,000 in rent, that would make me significantly cost burdened because half of my income monthly is going toward my housing. So 34.4% of those who reported having a disability are also significantly housing cost burden. 14.8% live in poor quality housing versus 7.9% of the general population. And the point that we kind of want to get across today is that our housing policy has been a big part of the problem. So this presentation was originally developed for Middle Housing Week. So we did also want to get the point across that middle housing, duplexes, fourplexes, things like that can be part of the solution to this issue. So another real quick preface is we wanted to give some acknowledgements. We are not necessarily inclusive housing experts. We do work in inclusion. So we talk to people with disabilities and other people who may be affected by housing discrimination about their rights and responsibilities under the Fair Housing Act. We talk about how we can best include people with disabilities in housing and make it more accessible to them, but we also needed to use a lot of other information in order to get some of these statistics. So we wanted to acknowledge the Sightline Institute, AARP, specifically the Livable Communities page, Disability Rights Oregon, Fair Housing Accessibility First, and Scott P. Moore, who is an attorney that works for Fair Housing Accessibility First. A little bit about the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. So we are truly a statewide civil rights organization. And we really are statewide. We have people who man different regions of the state. So I am metro area and sometimes Salem. We have somebody stationed in Eastern Oregon. We have the coast covered, Central Oregon, Southern Oregon. So we really are truly statewide. We're what is known as a FIP, so Fair Housing Initiatives Program. So we get to proactively promote justice, equity, and inclusion in housing, and we do that through two main avenues. So the first avenue is things like this. Sam and I are both part of the education and outreach branch at the Fair Housing Council, and we educate people about their rights and responsibilities under fair housing law. And then we have another branch who deals with enforcement. And so if somebody has experienced housing discrimination, they can go to our enforcement branch. And they can help conduct an investigation to see if discrimination is occurring, as well as teach people how to advocate for themselves, as well as if the need arises, helping somebody file litigation. So we also have part of our programming is advocating for state and local policies which advance fair housing. So we also do some work in public policy as well. So I've already mentioned fair housing law like a million times already. So let's really quick go over what does that mean. The first thing that people think of when they think of fair housing law is the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which was passed shortly after the assassination of Dr. King. But it includes more than that. It is an entire body of federal, state, local, and judicial civil rights laws which uphold equal access to housing. Can you tell that I'm getting tongue-tied? So there are a few different things that are included in this. Fair housing law, Oregon fair housing law that was passed in the 1950s that covered specifically public housing. So essentially what those laws said is that it was illegal to discriminate or segregate public housing. However, private housing was still kind of a free-for-all at that time. Then there was the Civil Rights Act of 1968, specifically Title 8 and 9, that established that it was illegal to discriminate or segregate housing on the basis of protected class, which we will go over in a minute. And then, of course, there is the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988. And this is really important. We're going to be talking about this quite a bit throughout this presentation. What the Fair Housing Amendments Act did was it established new protected classes, and it also allowed for the enforcement of fair housing law. So something that's really interesting is between 1968 and 1988, while the fair housing law was in place, there was no avenue for enforcing it. So in 1988 established the FIP program, the Fair Housing Initiatives Program, which gave an avenue to enforce fair housing laws. So it's a really important act. So I mentioned federal protected classes earlier. So protected classes under fair housing law are based on identity and make it illegal to discriminate and segregate based on your federally protected class. The first four that were passed initially were race, color, national origin, and religion, and those were passed with the 1968 Civil Rights Law. In the 1970s, with the culmination of the women's rights movement, we see the addition of sex as a protected class. More recently, gender identity and sexual orientation were also included as a federally protected class, as well as victims of domestic violence. And the reason that that's a subcategory under sex is because we know that women and femme identifying people are disproportionately affected by domestic violence. So that is acknowledged under the protected class of sex. And then in 1988, with the Amendments Act, the Fair Housing Amendments Act, familial status and disability were added. Familial status refers to families with children under the age of 18. And this also includes pregnant people, it includes people in foster care, and basically any definition of family that includes children under the age of 18. But of course, today we're going to be talking about disability. So as many of you may know, the definition of disability under the Fair Housing Act differs a little bit from the definition of disability under ADA or, qualification for Social Security disability and things like that. So I do want to say that the definition of disability under the Fair Housing Act is purposefully broad. So it is defined as a mental or a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits an individual in one or more major life activities, including but not limited to breathing, climbing, concentrating, hearing, interacting with others, learning, lifting, seeing, self-care, standing, and walking. This definition is purposefully broad and purposefully inclusive. It's meant to include as many people in the definition as possible, rather than things like, Social Security disability are exclusive. They want a very specific definition of disability in order to give that kind of assistance. But this is a very inclusive, broad definition. And you can see how a lot of these things would substantially impair somebody's access to housing, right? So mainly, climbing, lifting, walking, standing, these kinds of things. So we're going to be focusing mainly today on physical accessibility. So, of course, other things like interacting with others, issues with concentrating also require specifications under fair housing, but we're going to be focusing mostly on physical mobility issues today. So the other interesting thing about the two protected classes that were added in 1988, the familial status and disability, is that familial status and disability, the membership to those protected classes is conditional, right? So what does that mean? That means that if you take, for example, the protected class of race or the protected class of religion, it doesn't matter what your race or your religion is, you have protections under the Fair Housing Act, right? Even if you are part of the dominant majority. However, familial status and disability only protects you as long as you have children or as long as you have a disability, right? You are not protected by the same protections specifically by not having a disability or not having children, right? So the membership on those protections is conditional. The other thing that's unique about them is that the physical needs of the housing are very specific, right? Families with children may need more space in the house. They may need more bedrooms. The physical requirement of their dwelling is different than those families without children. And the same thing with disability, right? There are physical needs that need to be met in their housing. The other thing that's really unique about this is that additional protections are allowed with these two protected classes, right? Things like preference policies are legal for disability. So for example, in Portland, if a fully accessible unit becomes available and somebody with a disability applies to that unit specifically within 48 hours, they're going to get preference over everybody else who doesn't have a disability who may be applying for that accessible unit. This is not the case with other protected classes. Preference policies can be problematic under fair housing, even if they may have their heart in the right place. So other kinds of preference policies don't fly under fair housing. However, with familial status and disability, they do. And this housing has been historically really underbuilt, which is kind of the crux of the issue that we're facing now with the need for accessible housing. Oh yeah, preference policies just with the ADU. Thanks, Sam. Yep. And we'll come back to that. So, reasonable modification. What's a reasonable modification? One of these additional protections that I mentioned earlier is I mentioned earlier that there are additional protections allowed for the protected class of disability, and one of those is the ability to ask for a reasonable modification. So a modification is a physical change to a unit in order to ensure accessibility. So residents must have full use and enjoyment of the unit and other included services or amenities of the property. Reasonable accommodations are meant to facilitate that. So things like adding a ramp up to a doorway, adding grab bars in the shower, things like that are meant to facilitate the full use and enjoyment of a unit, even if they are not already present, right? So that's the modification. The issue with this is that modifications need to be reasonable. So when somebody applies for a modification in their unit, they have to, first of all, prove that they need it. And second of all, they need to meet the requirement of reasonable. What does reasonable mean? Well, this gets a little tricky, right? So there are 4 reasons that a landlord or property manager, whoever, can deny the request for a modification. And those 4 reasons are: it is too expensive, it causes an undue administrative burden, it requires them to do something that is not part of their job description, or it presents a direct threat to the property. Now, some of these necessary modifications that somebody needs might be too costly or extensive to be considered reasonable under these 4 conditions. So, for example, a lot of older buildings are built with really narrow hallways. When hallways are that narrow, they need to be widened in order to be used by somebody with a wheelchair. And that is a major renovation that cannot be reversed, right? So a landlord, property manager, homeowners association, or whatever, may be able to deny that modification based on that reason. Other things like, changing the height or width of doorways is a major remodel, getting rid of kitchen islands, things like that, right? The other barrier to this is that a lot of the times, especially in privately owned housing, the tenant is responsible for paying for these modifications. So that presents another barrier, right? How much does it cost to put a ramp up to your doorway? How much does it cost to put in grab bars in the shower? And they can be required to pay for the removal of that after they move out. So the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988 sets 7 standards for units that are considered fully accessible. And we're going to talk about that right now. So for a unit to be considered fully accessible, an accessible building entrance needs to be on an accessible route, right? So it needs to be a continuous path that can be used by a person with a wheelchair and is safe for other people with disabilities. So it needs to be wide enough to be used with a wheelchair. It can't have too many tight corners. It can't have too steep of an incline, things like that. The other stipulation with this is the entrance needs to be connected by an accessible route to public transit, accessible parking, or public streets and sidewalks. So not only does it need to be accessible inside the building, but it needs to be accessible to the public sphere, to the outside of the community as well. The second requirement of a fully accessible unit is that there needs to be accessible public and common use areas. So for example, if there's a laundry room, there needs to be at least 1 laundry machine that's an accessible height for somebody using a wheelchair. The mailboxes need to be an appropriate height. Safety features like smoke detectors and fire alarms need to be also at an appropriate height for somebody with a wheelchair. That can't be tucked into a corner where somebody on a wheelchair couldn't feasibly reach it. Requirement 3, this is a big one, is usable doors by a person in a wheelchair. Generally, this refers really to the width of the door, right? Again, I mentioned earlier that older buildings had a lot narrower hallways and a lot narrower doorways. So in order for a unit to be considered fully accessible, it needs to be a certain width. It also talks about the height and type of doorknobs and door handles that can be used. So as you can see in the picture in the bottom right-hand corner, someone is using a cane to hook around a door and shut it, right? So when a door opens inward, it becomes really difficult for somebody who needs that kind of, or needs to use a cane if that doorknob is a circle, right? So it becomes impossible to reach through and pull it in. So it needs to have a specific type and height of doorknob. Requirement 4 has to do with what it looks like inside the unit itself. So there needs to be an accessible route into and through the dwelling unit. So what this means is that there can't be appliances that don't leave room for somebody in a wheelchair to navigate around them. There needs to be corners that are able to be navigated by somebody in a wheelchair, things like that. Okay, so requirement 5 is that light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, and other environmental controls need to be in an accessible location. Again, so same thing with fire alarms, like I said earlier, they need to be at an appropriate height and they need to be somewhere where, not tucked into a corner where somebody can't reach it. This one is really interesting to me. So requirement 6 is that reinforced walls in bathrooms, or walls in bathrooms need to be reinforced so that there can later be installation of grab bars. However, there does not need to initially be grab bars in the shower. It really only stipulates that the shower is able to physically withstand the installation of those grab bars, which I find really interesting. And lastly, the kitchen and bathroom need to be usable. So this has to do with counter heights. It also has to do with the amount of floor space, say in a bathroom, right? If a bathroom is really narrow and small, it's going to become really difficult for somebody in a wheelchair to navigate that space. Another big issue was with toilets being too close to corners or too close to the wall so that somebody could not feasibly navigate to the toilet in a wheelchair. So this is kind of the biggest one, right? And it also kind of constitutes that serious remodel that we were talking about earlier, right? So sometimes when somebody needs to request a reasonable modification, the entire counter needs to be a foot lower. That's a major remodel, right? So this is another really important one. So the interesting thing about this is that in 1988, when the Fair Housing Amendments Act was passed, it was said that after March of 1991, all buildings with 4 or more dwellings must include at least one accessible unit. So think about that for a second. Most buildings have more than 4 units, right? So only one needs to be accessible, fully accessible in regards to the 7 stipulations I just talked about. The accessible unit has to be at ground level, or if there's not a feasible unit at ground level, the building has to have an elevator. And state and local governments may increase these requirements. This is also really interesting. So in the language of the Amendments Act, it does say that states and local governments can make increases to this requirement. So if, for example, instead of saying one in every building with 4 or more units, they can say one in every building with 3 or more units, or they can say there needs to be 2 accessible units per building or something along those lines. So with that, I am going to welcome my colleague Sam to talk a little bit about zoning.
Thank you. All right, so as people involved in housing, city planning, and everything like that know that for about 100 years, by and large in American cities, single family and multifamily zones have been strictly separated. And because of that requirement that was put into the Fair Housing Amendments Act, where buildings with 4 or more units were the only buildings that were subjected to that requirement, that also effectively meant that all accessible unit construction was going to be in multifamily zones because there was not anything being built in between middle housing types that we've been talking about for the last couple of years in Oregon. Very few jurisdictions across the country have ever taken advantage of that element in the Fair Housing Amendments Act that said that they could increase the standards. And as a result, since 1991, so over 30 years, just about 200,000 accessible units have been built across the nation. And bear in mind, we are a nation where over 1/5 of the population have some kind of disability. So clearly the need is way higher than the rate that accessible units are being built. So middle housing was re-legalized in Oregon with House Bill 2001. Communities over 25,000 needed to legalize things like fourplexes, cottage clusters, and townhouses in many single family zones. And that means that those are housing types that were not traditionally considered multifamily, but do end up, meeting the requirements of the Fair Housing Amendments Act where they will have to have at least one accessible unit built into them. In addition to that, many accessory dwelling units, which Oregon legalized in all cities in 2017, are already designed to accessible standards. This is especially true for ones that are built modular, which is much easier to do with an ADU than with standard stick-built homes. And they're usually subjected to fewer burdensome design requirements. So House Bill 2001 said that you couldn't put additional housing or additional design requirements that you were not already subjecting single family homes to. But many cities, in my experience, took the route of having even fewer design standards just to ease the process of getting middle housing developments permitted. So as a result, there's definitely a high probability that that even beyond the 4 or more unit developments that are going in that are going to be required to have accessible units, there's already the possibility of greater accessibility just based on the housing types themselves. So as a good example, we've got this 2-story ADU here that is not subjected to any of the porch requirements that make it virtually impossible to build accessible units in single family homes. So you can roll right in and it's much easier to make a structure like that accessible as opposed to a traditional single family home. So all the way back in 1968, in the original Fair Housing Act, we had what was called affirmatively furthering fair housing. That was a stipulation that said that housing and urban development itself, as well as anyone who receives HUD funds, they must make meaningful actions to overcome existing patterns of segregation. So not perpetuating new segregation or discrimination, that's not enough. If you're receiving HUD funds, you're held to a higher standard, and you have to show meaningful steps to undo the segregation that already exists. Now, that hasn't had a lot of teeth, but at least we can all agree and understand what that essentially means. But because of zoning codes, because of the way that planning has occurred for the last 100 years, ironically, the Fair Housing Amendment Act, a Fair Housing Act, had a segregationist effect because it was putting accessible units, the vast majority of accessible units, strictly in multifamily zones. Middle housing reforms can actually take that same requirement and make it an integrationist policy. So that was the step that was missing to take that accessible unit requirement and turn it into an integrationist policy rather than a segregationist policy. So here's another thing that we've been talking about for a while, a term that I certainly did not coin, but is out there, is the silver tsunami. And it is appropriate to talk about that in the context of 2022, because you can very clearly see it on this graph where it's a huge spike. This year, both in the United States and across the world, the largest number of people in history is turning 75. And what is the significance of that? Well, it's 75 and older. That is the predictive factor for if you have mobility-related disabilities or not. Obviously, many people under 75 have mobility-related disabilities, but if you're looking for one factor that correlates it, that's it, over 75. 1 in 4 Americans has a disability, but that number is up to 2 in 5 for seniors, and I believe it's even higher for those specifically over 75. And this, I thought, was a really significant poll that was done this year, and it is consistent with polls that have been done in the past. 88% of adults 50 and older say it's their goal to age in place. So for this rapidly expanding population, they have made it very clear what their preference is, which is that they want to stay in their neighborhoods. And considering that they are most likely to have mobility-related disabilities, well, then you can see that there is a big gap in policy that we're going to have to address. So this this represents the scale of the need. This number was from a Sightline study that was conducted in 2019. In Oregon alone, 6,781 accessible units are needed to be constructed per year, every year for the foreseeable future. So that is a huge, I mean, that's an astronomical number. That's approximately 1 in 5 new homes that need to be built. So this whole conference, we've been talking about a lot of different crises, right? We've been talking about a capacity crisis. We've been talking about an affordability crisis. We also clearly have an accessibility crisis. And there's a lot of overlap between those two things, but there's also unique factors about each of those aspects of needed housing. And I also want to reiterate something that Gina brought up, which is that 1 for every 4 development, that's a floor, not a ceiling. Again, going back to the 1988 requirements, the 1988 law, state and local jurisdictions are absolutely able to increase the standards because just focusing on those 4 or more unit developments is not even going to come close to filling the need. It solves the segregation problem, right? It does that, but it does not even come close to solving the capacity, the quantity issue. So housing with accessibility requirements, because of the way that House Bill 2001 was written, are going to be concentrated in those large cities of 25,000 or more. House Bill 2001 legalized duplexes in single family zones in 10,000 to 25,000. That's great for capacity, but those developments are not going to be required to have accessible units. So because of that, these accessible units are probably going to be concentrated in those cities. And they're also going to be likelier in area with certain factors like large lots, right? The places where it's easiest and cheapest to build high capacity developments are the places where it's probably going to happen. So there's still reasons, even with House Bill 2001, why these units are going to be geographically concentrated. So that brings us to the other 2019 housing reform bill, House Bill 2003. And this is something that's still, not fully formed, right? The processes were pretty well spelled out in House Bill 2003, but the rulemaking and the different new documentation and new processes that were spelled out in House Bill 2003 are just now kind of going through the rulemaking process. One of them that I think is really significant was housing production strategies, right? So in addition to the housing needs analysis, which Oregon cities have had to do since the 1970s, this adds a new planning document that cities are going to have to do 1 year after their housing needs analysis. So the housing needs analysis identifies the needs of the city, and then they have to follow it up with an actual list of things that the city is going to do to meet those stated needs. And one of the things that I think was really great that the state did and that DLCD did is to specifically identify that that the cities were going to need to consider measures to promote affordable and accessible housing specifically. So it's not just about meeting capacity, but they actually have to focus on those additional factors. And those strategies can, they run the gamut, zoning and code changes, reducing regulatory impediments, but also direct, financial incentives, things like SDC waivers or deferrals, tax exemption and abatements, land acquisition, lease, and partnerships. So actually providing the land for developments like this that are going to help these populations. And then category Z, which I really like. They just jump straight from F to Z and say, choose your own adventure. So obviously, this is still a few years out. The rulemaking process is happening at this very moment. And there's someone in the room who I know is going to be heavily involved in the housing reform next session. and putting this stuff into action. So I'm really excited to see where that goes. One community that I want to point to that Gina did mention is Portland. So the Portland accessory dwelling unit code that came into effect in 2021, I believe, now requires properties with 2 or more ADUs to have 1 unit which is visitable. Now, visitable is different under fair housing law from actually, fully accessible unit. It doesn't have to meet all of those 7 requirements, but it does have the basic structural and navigability requirements. And that makes it much easier to upgrade a unit. If a unit's already visible, it's much, much easier to upgrade that after the fact to a fully accessible unit. So this is a great start. I mean, this is the first instance in Oregon that I can think of where a city actually took advantage of that stipulation in the 1988 law that says you can actually require more out of housing. And this is another thing that Gina mentioned, but the fair access and renting policy from 2019 created a preference policies in accessible ADUs. So that was what she was talking about with people with disabilities who are applying for an accessible unit. They have the first crack at it. Preference policy, if you are working for a city, if you're an elected official or working for a city, please consult your attorneys before crafting any kind of preference policy. But when it comes to these things, it is legal, it does work. Just be careful with how you create it. That's all I will say. So I want to talk about how that plays into a broader dynamic of accessible communities. So accessible housing, infrastructure, and transit planning, they all go hand in hand, right? We have to think about this from a holistic perspective. Think back to requirement 1 of those accessibility standards. It's not just about the navigable path within the building, it's also from the building into the public sphere. So if you are involved in transit planning, if you're involved in infrastructure planning, you also need to be concerned with accessibility and how that interacts with private properties and their accessible paths. And going back to that concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing, it considers neighborhood conditions, not just the conditions of the house itself. So location, location, location. Are these accessible units in areas of high economic opportunity? Are they disproportionately exposed to environmental pollutants? Are they all located next to smokestacks and landfills? That would be a problem if you are disproportionately impacting a particular community. Are there access to good schools, right, in this neighborhood? So all of those things broadly have to be considered when cities are crafting their accessibility processes and trying to promote accessible unit development in their cities. And there's an increasing social desirability behind this, right? A lot of the inspiration for the presentation today came from the tremendous work that AARP's livability communities is doing. They've just put together a really tremendous network of cities who are seeing those graphs of the silver tsunami and saying, okay, this is a serious population that we need to think of when we are crafting our policies. And it's important for the continued economic vitality of our city to be considering this huge population. This is also something that I have experienced in my work. So as House Bill 2001 codes were coming together in a lot of cities, I was involved in some advisory committee groups in a very broad variety of communities, right? I was involved in Woodburn, I was involved in Lake Oswego, 2 cities that in some ways could not be, further apart. But this was something that really united people. And it goes back to that idea of, 88% of people over 50 say that it is a priority to stay in their neighborhoods. Disability connects almost everyone, right? It represents such a large percentage of the population that if you yourself do not have a disability, almost certainly you are related to someone who does, you are friends with someone who does, you are a coworker with someone who does. This is something that truly connects the entire American population. And a rapidly aging population would like to stay in their community. And I'm sure that if you know and love people with disability, you would also like them to stay in the community and to have that kind of stability. So this is something that across, economic status, across racial lines, and it's really is something that is important to a lot of people, aging in place, and making sure that everyone has equal enjoyment to housing. And going back to those statistics that we talked about in the first slide, unsuitable housing increases a lot of really detrimental things to the individual and to the community. Things like social isolation, right? If you don't have access to accessible infrastructure that connects your house to the rest of the community, then you're going to be much more isolated. Poor health. If you don't have housing that meets your needs or access to housing, then obviously that's going to affect your health in a lot of detrimental ways. Lack of economic opportunity. If you are being forced to pay for the accessibility upgrades to your house because you don't have access to a affordable, accessible unit, and you're having to make these changes through the reasonable modification process, then you're probably going to end up having to pay for it yourself unless you happen to be in public housing. So that already is a huge drain both on the individual and on the community, right? Community economic vitality. It also limits people with disabilities from being fully participatory in the economy if they're not able to easily access transportation from their house to their work, etc. Accessibility, this concept I have found can really make people middle housing converts in communities that have a reputation for being historically exclusionary, historically, NIMBY. I have actually found that this issue really starts to break down those walls when you talk about it in terms of how it affects people that they know, that they love, a category that they fall into themselves. So this is a really important way to build allies in what we're all trying to do here, which is increase housing opportunity for everyone. So this is the moment, right? Our housing stock is deficient for our most vulnerable. We all know that. The housing we do have, because of planning, existing planning processes and a lack of legal requirements, it's segregated. And the scale of this crisis is growing, right? So existing law, like 1988, like House Bill 2001, it will get us part of the way. But it's up to us to get communities to raise the bar and get us the rest of the way. And our entire community is going to be healthier when we do. Thanks. We're happy to take questions. I'll give you the mic. Yeah. There we go. It's not on yet. I'll say as we start doing questions, so you'll see we've got our before breaking ground brochure on all your seats. That has those 7 federal requirements for accessibility in it, along with some other information. So if you don't want to rely on the tiny text from the from the handout or from the handout, then yeah, it's in there. If you're watching online, it's also on that. Also, if you do happen to work for a local government, or if you are an advocate in your community to local governments, We've got a guide that we put together in 2016. It is the Guide for Developing Accessible and Age-Friendly Zoning Code. I've got 15 copies of this. So if anyone wants it, you can come up here and get it. We also have it on our website, and I'd be happy to send you guides. It's got a real nice checklist for kind of defining that. Yes, Jean.
I was just thinking in terms of all the infomercials I used to watch way at night that was like, get your hover round, insurance pays for it. I was wondering in terms of aging, how common is it for certain modifications to be covered by insurance versus not covered by insurance?
I don't have an answer for that at all. Actually, Shail, do you know any information about that? Yeah. If I realized that she didn't have the mic for that, so people on Zoom probably couldn't hear that, but she mentioned that actually just yesterday it was announced that Oregon was approved for a Medicaid waiver that will allow Medicaid to be billed for housing and food related needs. And so maybe there's the possibility that we could use some of those funds for accessibility. Great.
Thank you. So just a clarification question on the multifamily buildings containing 4 or more units. I've kind of heard the answer go both ways. Is that the individual building must contain 4 units or more, or is that the property complex in a multifamily housing?
I think it's the development.
The total development.
I don't think it's.
That's the answer I tend to side with more because it's more inclusive. But
that is my understanding, is that it's the development, and so like if it's a detached complex, I would think that it's that is my understanding.
Hi, I'd like to know or your suggestions for moving away from type A unit requirements, type B unit requirements, UFUS requirements, and more towards like a social model of disability?
I do not have any experience in those requirements, so I would love to have a conversation with you later about what exactly that entails. Or actually, I mean, we've got plenty of time if you want to follow up now. If yeah, go ahead.
Sure, maybe I'm a fish out of water in here. UFUS, like federal accessibility standard.
Oh, okay.
And then type A units are like adaptable units. Type B is kind of a different kind of adaptable unit. There's just kind of these myriad codes. None of them really align, and they're all based on like a minimum standard for some person with a disability who does not exist.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great point. You'll notice actually, and I'm sorry that I didn't, I only have the limited engagement in this world through the kind of integration AFFH world. I don't do a lot in actual design and construction. In that design and construction brochure, you'll notice a bunch of different building codes that are considered safe harbor building codes. There is no one accessibility, in the very, very specific stuff. There's no one accessible standard. Do we have stuff on the chat? Is that?
Yeah.
Because we do have someone in the back of the room.
Yeah, I saw.
Okay.
Yeah. For my class, I'm supposed to write a little bit about the presenters. I was a bit late to the meeting, so can you guys remind me of your names?
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. I'm Samuel Goldberg, he, him pronouns. I am based in Portland. I cover statewide issues in regards to affirmatively furthering fair housing, land use. I also do our history presentations. If people in the room may have seen me do a history presentation at some point. It was probably me. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Gina Rizk. I am education and outreach specialist for the Portland Metro and Salem areas specifically. I do a lot of general education and outreach training about rights and responsibilities under fair housing law. And I also will be doing history presentations in the future, and recently just revamped our history presentation. So yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. There was the other one, which was a request for the slides. And I believe that all slides are going to be available online.
They are online, yes.
Yeah. So that should be there. Okay. So
If they're not online, you can email me.
Hi there. This might be going off of
Okay.
her question, but
Yeah.
so we were recently awarded 9% tax credits for a new deal. We're going to be partnering with Community Vision for a preference for their clients, and we are looking at just how best to go beyond the minimum code and beyond the minimum sizing in bathrooms and doorways, all that stuff, and talking with them upfront, way in advance about what they feel would best serve their clients. But one of the things we're talking about is bath use, accessibility, and having roll-in showers, and concerns about water and durability, and just also butting against concerns about putting all of the accessible units on the ground floor. Is there really a concern about putting all those units on the ground floor, or just we're getting some?
Well, yeah, I mean, at least one of them has to be either on the ground floor or accessible by an elevator. So as far as I know, there is no workaround for that.
Well, what I'm meaning is if we did want to put all of the accessible units on the ground floor rather than on upper floors, is there concern about that?
I don't believe so. Not that I've heard. Yeah, I in fact, when I talk to communities in terms of when the middle housing code was going in, I very clearly told them, over and over again, maximize the number of ground floor units that are coming in under your middle housing code, because those are the ones that are going to be easiest to make fully accessible.
Yeah, I mean, the one other issue is that with the elevated building, unfortunately the elevators do go down. And
yes.
Sometimes the elevator companies have to order a part from Germany or something crazy, and that it's just terrible to think of those people being stuck upstairs. So.
Absolutely. And it's something that happens all the time. So I completely agree. And the more accessible units at ground level, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Great. That's what I wanted to hear.
I was just going to anecdotally echo that because I've had conversations recently with, so I work with Sam and Gina, and in Astoria, I know there's a building that's for seniors, and a lot of them have mobility issues, and the elevator was broken for over a month. And so that's an issue, and they're trapped in their apartments basically. And then I just spoke with somebody the other day who has mobility issues, and there's just fear of if there's a fire and they, I don't want to go down by the elevator, but I don't have ability to go down the stairs. So I'm just kind of piggybacking and affirming that mission.
Thank you.
Regarding House Bill 2003, for cities that are closer to the 10,000 population are going to have a more difficult time with the housing production strategy. Or is there technical assistance written into the bill, or how can we be helpful to smaller cities?
Yeah, there is I would say more technical assistance coming from DLCD than there ever has before for these kinds of planning processes. The first, so the study that was done on housing production strategies, the kind of model housing production strategies that was done was, I believe, fully funded by DLCD, and they intentionally did it in 3 communities that were very different. I believe it was Medford, Tigard, and in Eastern Oregon, LeGrand. Does anyone know? I think it was LeGrand. I could be wrong. But so yes, I mean, there is the assumption that communities that fall in the medium-sized cities certainly initially are going to be getting quite a bit of support for the housing production strategies process. That's okay.
I'm curious what the discussions, if any, have been around other types of accessibility accommodations. So obviously, we're talking about a lot of physical accessibility accommodations, looking at things like audio, visual, neurological.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And that is definitely something that would fall under that 1988 stipulation that cities and state and local can increase the standards. Yeah, that's absolutely something that I think local jurisdictions can and should be looking into. It was written to the accessibility standards were written to the standard of wheelchair accessibility because there was the feeling that was the most high barrier mobility related disability. So if you covered that, then you were also covering people with who are using walkers, or people people who are well, there's a broad variety of disabilities. The last time I did this presentation, the only other time I did this presentation, and some of you may have been involved in that one, most of the discussion ended up being about smoking in the building. People who had disabilities that were extremely sensitive to smoking, and a discussion about whether accessibility standards should include things like, wall and window requirements that would be better at filtering things like smoke, because of the significantly increased burden on people with disabilities because of air pollution. Those are all interesting concepts. I would love to see more work done on that.
I was going to say that I think, so I'm Shyle. I work with Sam and Gina and Eliza as well. And one thing that we're also hearing about often related to disability is the increased number of people living with autism, and specifically families where there's a child with autism, and part of their, one of their symptoms is, loud yelling, screaming. And so we're getting a lot of calls on our hotline from these families who are living in apartments, but they're violating the rental agreement because the noise level is beyond what is acceptable. And these units haven't been soundproofed in a way that really would accommodate that type of a disability. So as we see the population still continue to grow with numbers of people living with that specific disability, it will also be interesting to see how that starts to shape some of the policies around, design inclusivity, because that soundproofing actually really is very important for these families to have equal access to housing. So I'm interested to see where that goes over the next 10 years or so.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting the way that accessibility requirements were written. Again, they're there to fill the gap of things that are clearly necessary in housing to serve the person with a disability. But if they're not built in from the beginning, then it's very quickly going to become unreasonable in terms of cost, unreasonable in terms of the extensiveness of the renovations. So when we're talking about different upgrades, different physical modifications to buildings that are there to serve people of non-mobility related disabilities. I think that that's kind of the defining factor on what's going to end up being required sometime in the future. Is this an upgrade that could be relatively easily done, relatively inexpensively done? If not, I don't think it will ever make it into as an additional accessibility requirement. I think it's very much written to the ones that are just impossible, or borderline impossible to do if you're not doing it from the beginning. Yeah.
Thanks. I think that the gap that people are pointing out that, I think is really important to highlight is that the definition of disability under the Fair Housing Act is broad on purpose, right? It doesn't just encompass mobility issues, but the problem happens is that we don't have policy to back that up. So I think, the point that people are bringing up is very valid and definitely something that I just wanted to highlight. And as a room for improvement, and the fact that disability doesn't just look one way, and the policy needs to reflect that.
Yeah, current law is a floor, not a ceiling, and I think we should all remember that and take that into our work. Yeah.
I was wondering, from a development and a design standpoint, do you know of resources that show just new and innovative appliances, fixtures, just ways of design for mobility issues or others that we can just kind of constantly keep current on as we develop our properties?
Most of the resources that I relied on were very much the floor, not the ceiling, not the most advanced technologies. It looks like you might have something to add.
Yeah, I think you could look at what's called universal design.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Thanks,
that
Gina.
and there's just a whole bunch that goes into that. But if you look that up and research it, it's basically, how do we make our spaces as accessible as possible, not just some areas, but all areas, and how do we try to accommodate as many different type of people as possible? As noted, once you design and build something, it's really hard to then change it. So how do we bake that in from the beginning? So,
yeah, I actually, come to think of it, I did get some of these pictures from Universal Design Resources. So this is an example of kind of more advanced, cutting edge ways of creating the most accessible spaces possible. There seems to be a lot of work being done on this in Australia, because I'm pretty sure that's where I got both of these from, was maybe the local government of Victoria, if I'm remembering right. So yeah, that's yeah, there are definitely resources out there for finding out what are the most advanced techniques. Yeah.
I got really excited about universal design. I used to be an elementary school teacher, so universal design is very important to me, and I look at it through that lens. And that being said, I wonder if there are standards that you can look at where how schools are being built, because I would assume that all of those building codes need to be highly accessible and universal to all of the children in that building. So I don't really know exactly if those are publicly available, but it might be a place to look.
Yeah, clearly there are very few examples of local jurisdictions who have upped the standards of accessibility for housing, but there are probably more examples of those that have upped the standards for public accommodations. And so, relying on, taking the lead from those might be a good place to start. Anyone else? I know we're getting to the end. Yeah.
This is just a satellite question or a tangential question, but and of course I would have to ask this because it has to do with animals. But is conversation about assistance animals, does it come into play in any of this inclusive by design? Because in Fair Housing Council of Oregon, we hear a lot of debate about what's a pet, what's an assistance animal, and and it's not just for people with mobility issues. It could be for people with depression or whatever other So I'm just wondering if that ever comes into the conversation when we're talking about inclusive by design, because that would also spill out into common space, for instance, issues of having, animals in the property too. So just curious about that.
I have not heard any examples of that happening, being built into the design, either to ADA standards or to Fair Housing Amendments Act standards. It's an interesting concept for sure, but yeah. Oh,
I do. I haven't seen it, specific to AFFH and things like that, the same what that Sam mentioned. However, the presentation yesterday about Deacon Court and making sure that there are outdoor spaces for people, and also, previous to this, there was another, trauma-informed building codes, things like that, that can be looked at from a perspective. And then the other thing that I would say is also universal design. And looking at the way that things like schools and public accommodations are built in that way in order to have outdoor spaces and common areas that are friendly for assistance animals, things like that. So, yeah.
Just as a side note about universal design for schools, I lived in Spain for a year with my son, and we went to Finland. And so if you want to talk about universal design in schools and accessibility for everybody, look to Finland.
So there's a question on chat, which is, in addition to the silver tsunami, is the rising number of people with long COVID also expected to drive the number of needed accessible units? And how is that being considered uniquely?
That's a great question. I don't think that has the full implications of that have really been explored. Obviously, as we keep coming back to, accessible standards are written strictly with mobility related disabilities in mind. So long COVID does, things like fatigue issues that come along with long COVID. There certainly may be a documented increase in people with mobility related disabilities, but I have not seen those numbers yet. I don't think that's something we'll know for some time. Anything else? If you're feeling shy, you can come talk to Gina and I afterwards. One thing please, if you could do the evaluation. My time, Gina's time on this was actually funded by Oregon Housing and Community Services, and they would very much like to see how you thought we did. So please do that and drop them off at one of the front tables. Drop them off with Shile back there as you're leaving. Again, if you are interested in the age-friendly zoning code guide, this is something that we will be updating in the near future, but this one's from 2016, so I would say that it is still pretty current. I would say it's a really good guide. In particular, there's something called the age-friendly checklist, which I think is just a really great tool to use for every single development, for every single land use decision that cities are making. You've got a real quick resource, quick way to check and make sure that you are doing things for in an age-friendly manner.